We are really excited to have both land trusts as well as Sam Quinn from SUNY ESF here to share the work that they're doing related to stewardship and conservation in the Skaneateles Lake watershed. My name is Camille Marcotte, and I'm the water and ecology educator with Cornell Cooperative Extension, Onondaga County. I just want to go over a few quick things, and then I'll introduce our first speaker and let him take it away. So the way the program is structured this morning is there will be about 45 minutes for the presentation and question and answer, and then 15 minutes built in for folks who want to take a break for any extra questions that might pop up, and also time for us to transition over to the next speaker. I know a lot of people signed up for all 3 sessions or multiple sessions, and 3 hours of Zoom is a lot. So I wanted to give folks a chance to take a break, step away from your computer, stop staring at a screen. So each new presentation will start on the hour. So if you do need to step away, don't worry, we won't start until the top of the hour. Let's see if I can advance the slides. There we go. So we are using Zoom in webinar mode. So right now you're all muted, your video is off except for our co-hosts and panelists, just so there's no background noise. If at the end you want to ask a question through audio, you can click the little raise hand button at the bottom of the screen and I can unmute you. We're going to hold all questions until the end, but feel free to type any questions that you have into the chat or Q&A function. Through the Q&A function, you can also ask questions anonymously if you'd prefer to do that. I'll be monitoring both of those for when we get to the question and answer portion at the end. So all sessions will be recorded. So I'll be posting those to the Skaneateles website as well as the Cornell Cooperative Extension Onondaga County website, and I'll send the links to where those recordings will be posted after this program today. And I'll also share an evaluation form where we can get your feedback. I'm just going to quickly introduce CCE Onondaga and the Skaneateles Education Program. CCE Onondaga is part of the nationwide extension system, which in New York State is through Cornell University. And New York State Extension has a presence in every single county, and we provide research-based resources and information to community members. We have many different program areas and topics covered, which you can see on the screen, and I am part of our natural resources program. Our Skaneateles Lake Education Program is funded by the City of Syracuse to provide education to help protect the water quality of Skaneateles Lake. And so we do that through offering trainings and programs like this one, providing resources and information, and sending updates about the lake and water quality through our listservs and social media. There's also a new website for Skaneateles Lake, which was created through a partnership between the local watershed communities, the City of Syracuse, Onondaga County Soil and Water Conservation District, as well as CCE Onondaga. So you can visit scanlakeinfo.org to check it out, and I'll also share that URL in the follow-up email as well. So I'm now going to introduce our first presenter, Max Heitner. So Max is the Director of Conservation with Finger Lakes Land Trust. Max works to acquire new properties and easements throughout the region while also partnering on conservation projects that incorporate both long-term protection and present-day restoration. When not focusing on conservation, Max enjoys outdoor recreation, college sports, and puttering around his backyard with its goats and chickens. He holds degrees in natural resources from the University of Illinois and the University of Michigan. So I will stop sharing and let Max take it away.
All right, thanks, Camille. Okay, so Camille, thanks for having me. Happy to be doing this with Albert and Sam. Excited to listen to their presentations later. So this presentation will be focused mostly on landscape conservation, It'll talk a little bit about water, land use, conservation easements, and what is involved in conservation easements, as well as other conservation solutions. So again, a brief table of contents as we look at this picture of the Staghorn Cliffs on the southeastern part of Skaneateles Lake. We'll have a landscape conservation overview. We'll talk a little bit about water and harmful aquatic blooms. We'll talk about conservation solutions, including easements, and then we'll go over a few projects in the Skaneateles Lake watershed. So landscape conservation, if you look at that bottom sentence, it includes protecting and restoring natural systems. And we as a regional land trust take a regional approach to this conservation. The reason I have these two maps here is I want you to look at the map on the left, which is a little bit of an outdated map, but it's still true today in where you see conservation lands in the United States. Most conservation lands are located west of the Rocky Mountains. If you look at New York State, you can see the two pink blobs on that left map, which are the Catskills and the Adirondacks. And as we move to the map on the right, you again can see there's a pretty good percentage of conservation lands in the Adirondacks and Catskills. Outside of those two regions of the state, it's pretty limited. And so as you look at the Finger Lakes region where we do our work, we're talking about mostly private land that's making up the vast majority of land ownership in the state. So now, as we take a more detailed look at our service area, the Finger Lakes region, you can see the light green are basically DEC-owned state forests. There's also state parks, wildlife management areas. We also have the only national forest in New York State is in Schuyler County between Seneca and Cayuga Lakes. This gives you a detailed look at the various conservation lands, which includes lands held by the Finger Lakes Land Trust, as well as lands held by the Central New York Land Trust, which you'll hear from later today. So why is landscape conservation important? One of the first reasons is landscape connectivity and wildlife movement. So today's landscape is a fragmented landscape where you have isolated wildlife habitat, and you need ways for wildlife as well as plants, as we have climate change, and you have plants that are moving to higher elevations, that are moving to more northern latitudes, that need connection in order to thrive. And so what ecologists often look at are these habitat patches. You see on the graphic to your right, the concept of stepping stone properties to be able to go from one habitat patch to another, or you might have a connected link, what's often called a corridor or a linkage that connect habitat patches all together. And so often what the Finger Lakes Land Trust is trying to do is focus on these connectivity parcels. And when we're prioritizing parcels to conserve, this is at the forefront. So we just talked a little bit about climate resiliency. This is a map taken from data from the Nature Conservancy, looking at climate corridors, climate resiliency in our service area of the Finger Lakes. And these are some of the models we use to help prioritize what properties to try to conserve in the region. We're looking at areas that connect already existing conservation land, as well as corridors that we anticipate will be important for ecological diversity with the changes that will come over the next many decades. So now we'll shift the conversation a little bit to water. So when we're talking about watersheds in the Finger Lakes region, it's really, you can divide it basically in half. Everything in green you're seeing here drains south into the Chesapeake Bay. And is more considered, the southern tier of our region, whereas everything in blue is draining into the Finger Lakes and then eventually into Lake Ontario, into the Great Lakes. So there's this watershed divide in the Finger Lakes region some draining south, some draining north. Now this is a satellite graphic that shows, it's a good look at kind of depth of some of the lakes and where sedimentation and nutrients might enter some of the lakes. So if you look, I'll point you to Skaneateles, which looks deep blue and beautiful. But if you look at some of the other lakes, you can see some of the shallower and higher sedimentation rates in the southern part of Owasco Lake, the southern end of Cayuga Lake by Ithaca, where it's very shallow, the northern end of Cayuga by Montezuma. You can see Honeoye on the west, which is the shallowest Finger Lake, which you can see basically just that sedimentation look from the satellite image. So clean water, it's really an important topic. The Finger Lakes play a really vital role in the region to provide clean water for the city of Syracuse, the city of Rochester, as well as all the local towns and villages in the area. The Skaneateles Lake specifically is the unfiltered drinking water source for the city of Syracuse, and is very important to conserve for that purpose. Stormwater is an important thing to manage because during large storms, water flows into roadside ditches, which have been used in our region for a long time due to our agricultural usage in this region, and leads to concentrated flows that can yield high nutrient runoffs into our lakes. So one of the issues that we're seeing is this observed change in very heavy precipitation events. This is one of the changes that we're seeing due to climate change in the northeastern region is rather than many smaller rain events, we're getting very large rain events, which rather than soaking into the soil, the rain rushes right over the surface into drainage ditches, into creeks, and then eventually into the lakes. So harmful aquatic blooms, often called algal blooms, HABs, they are cyanobacteria in large quantities, and they could have many different toxins, but one of the most common and one of the most harmful is called microcystin, which can be fatal to dogs and also make humans sick. And it's a threat for the region. It's a threat to public drinking water supplies. It's a threat to recreation and tourism. And it's not just an issue here. It's an issue worldwide as human usage is basically leading to, human activities are leading to various nutrients into water bodies all around the world, including in the Finger Lakes, and invasive species are going from one territory to the next. And, most recent findings regarding harmful aquatic blooms in this area is that the quagga mussel could be playing a large role, which is an invasive mussel species. Here's a look at what a harmful aquatic bloom looks like on Owasco Lake. And nutrient loading can come from various places. You could have failed septic systems on a lakeside cottage, runoff on impermeable surfaces on a parking lot. You can have the spreading of manure on a large agricultural operation, and the concentrated flows that develop in deep roadside ditches. All things that lead to higher nutrient loading into our water bodies. Here's another look right after a heavy storm event of highly turbid water, which is water with a high rate of sedimentation entering Owasco Lake. So the Green Revolution. So this is basically a period of time from the mid to late 20th century when agriculture changed and it gained efficiency. Basically gained efficiency by putting inputs into farms and technology and consolidating crops and consolidating fields and becoming bigger and better and more efficient. And that global competition that we have from today's marketplace has led to this farm consolidation and nutrient inputs to remain viable. and farms are more efficient than ever before. And we've set up a system in the Finger Lakes that helps with that efficiency. And part of that are things like tile drainage. This is a technology that for years has led to higher yields in crops and leads to these gains in efficiencies. But there is potentially this drawback of these gains in efficiencies, and that's this increase in concentrated flows and potential increase in nutrients that can flow to the water bodies. So as we talk about these issues, landscape connectivity, nutrient loading, and water quality, there are conservation solutions. And so some of these are protection, restoration, planning, research, monitoring, and the Finger Lakes Land Trust works in 3 of those. And so we'll talk a little bit about land protection, land restoration, and planning. So the mission of the Land Trust is a 4-pronged mission focused on scenic vistas, local foods, clean waters, and wild places for everyone. We've protected over 23,000 acres. We have 35 publicly accessible nature preserves. We have a deer hunting program, lots of hiking trails, undeveloped lakeshore, over 2,500 members, over 200 volunteers. And here's the full mission of the organization at the top left: to conserve forever the lands and waters of the Finger Lakes region, ensuring scenic vistas, clean water, local foods, and wild places for everyone. And so how we do land protection, this first item, and kind of the bread and butter of what the Land Trust does, is we do acquisitions. We will purchase properties or receive donations of properties. And those are the properties that are most obvious to anyone because they have a Finger Lakes Land Trust sign, they're a publicly accessible nature preserve. Another thing we'll do is cooperative acquisitions with other conservation entities. So that's where we would do a transfer of a property to DEC or New York State Parks or the Forest Service to increase the size or create a new public land. And then finally are the easements, which are properties that remain private. And so this is a good look at the first type. This is a nature preserve. You see a boardwalk. This is the Roy Park Nature Preserve in east of Ithaca. And this is a classic nature preserve for us. It's adjacent to a state forest, features trails, access to 6 Mile Creek, which is the drinking water supply for Ithaca. And we will own and manage it for the long term. But when you look at a map like this, you notice that the color that sticks out is orange. And that orange color is for our conservation easement projects, which is the most common way for us to conserve land. And we'll go over why that is in just a minute. So this map shows you dots, which are projects that are less than 20 acres. A medium-sized circle, which is 20 to 100 acres, and then the larger circles are projects that are over 100 acres. So let's talk now a little bit about conservation easements and how they help fill the gap as a conservation solution. So they are our most widely utilized conservation tool, and they maintain private ownership and do not permit public access. So the Finger Lakes Land Trust is a 501c3 tax exempt organization. So when we purchase or receive a donation of a nature preserve, that is something that then does not have taxes paid to the local town, whereas conservation easements keep properties on the local tax roll. So they're still a private property, but they're basically a landowner agreeing to various limitations and allowances on the property to protect the conservation value of the property. They live with the property through transfer of ownership. So when the property gets sold, that easement is still held by the Land Trust, and the Land Trust is responsible to monitor that easement once a year. So what do they look like? So this is a good example of what an easement land plan and survey. This is a survey overlaid on the land plan. So what it does is it's basically long-term planning for an undeveloped property, where we are dividing properties into various use zones that have different permissible uses. So on this property, you're seeing 4 different use zones. All the way to the right is the pink zone, which is a residential area. That's an area where the landowner is permitted to be able to build a house or restore their home if there's already a home there, and do basically any typical residential function. In yellow then is the agricultural field management zone, and that is an area where a landowner could conduct any agricultural activities, whether it's haying, pasturing, row crops, whatever it might be. That's allowed in that yellow zone. Then in green is what we call a forest management zone, and that's one where the landowner can do any kind of timber harvest for personal use, but then there's a trigger in the easement that if a landowner wants to do a commercial timber harvest, they need to do a forest management plan with a certified forester. And so that's a way where the Land Trust is overseeing that, that timber harvest is happening in a sustainable way. And then finally in the blue area is what we call our environmental protection zone, and that's basically our hands-off zone. So that's an area where a landowner could not do any timber harvest activities and is meant to be left alone as a buffer for the creek in this case. So let's look at what the actual document looks like a little bit. So different land trusts have different templates, and we even work with a few different type of easement documents depending what type of easement it is. But if you start on the left, you'll see we start with the purpose of the easement and then the conservation values. This is very important. It's really important that that 1.03, the conservation values, dictate and show why this property matters to be conserved. Because if a land trust is just holding easements on any which property, even if the conservation value is limited, then you have a potential for very poor community planning, where you're just securing large tracts of land that might not have value for wildlife or open spaces or public access, whatever it might be. It's very important that you have legitimate conservation values that you're protecting in this easement. Then if you look at Article 2, subdivision and conveyance, that's often one of the main items of these documents, is that they're limiting subdivision. There might be an allowance for 1 subdivision or 0, but that's a big part of what conservation easements do. If you go to your right, you see structures and improvements, and that dictates kind of what buildings, whether it's residential buildings, agricultural buildings, et cetera, can be constructed. So now we look at forest management. We talked about this a little bit at the couple slides ago. So what kind of forest management, habitat stand improvement can you do? Non-native invasive species, what can you do without consulting with the land trust versus, you know, a commercial timber harvest where you would have to consult with the land trust later in that document. You see Article 9 deals with mineral resources, et cetera. And then we have a notarized signature page at the end of the document. So what's another very important part of the easement is the survey. And the survey, because we're doing these internal zones, the survey is more than just an external boundary survey that a typical landowner would get, but we're actually surveying all of these internal zones. And these are part of what's getting monitored every year. Is basically the land trust has a conservation easement steward on staff that their role is going to these properties, walking these zone boundaries, and making sure that the various permissible uses are existing only in the right zone. So there's no residential home being built in the forest management zone. There's no corn crops being planted in the forest management zone, et cetera. And so this survey is listed as a Schedule A and recorded in the clerk's office along with the easement. Another key component of a conservation easement is something called the baseline documentation report. And this is basically a report that goes into the basic structure of a property at the time an easement is placed on the property. So it goes over ecological communities, soils, all these different ecological, geological elements. And then there's also much of the document is a series of photo points. So for this one, you see a cover page, you see, again, a notarized signature page. And then on the right, you see natural characteristics and ecological communities. Over here on the left, you see a map of ecological communities. And then on the right is what, half of these baseline documentation reports end up being, which is various photo points with captions. And the idea here is that you're seeing what does this property look like when this easement is in place, because these easements are permanent. They last forever. So 100 years from now, it's important to have this document to see what did this property look like when this easement was first put in place. And so this is utilized during that monitoring process every year. So, conservation easement summary. We can't buy our way to where we want to be. So when we talk about landscape connectivity or water quality protection and watershed protection, the Finger Lakes Land Trust doesn't have the funds to just purchase every property that we want to do. So easements are this tool that basically fills the gap between our key nature preserves, between making public lands larger. They can be fully donated or partially funded by grant opportunities. New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets does agricultural easements and partially funds those. The New York State Department of Environmental Conservation funds various projects, often related to water quality. And so at the bottom, let's all grab our shovels. So you can play a part in easements, whether you own a large piece of property or you just want to support or volunteer for a local land trust. So that's your overview of easements. And now we'll kind of go on to the next conservation solution. And that would be land restoration. So land restoration is something that the Finger Lakes Land Trust doesn't do as much of as land protection, but it's something where we do it in key areas and we do it when we can. And we're increasing it all the time. And this can mean a few different things. This is just a real basic sampling. It can mean wetland creation, creating areas to retain water on the landscape. It could mean a buffer, which is what you see in this photo, where you have strips of vegetation to filter and slow runoff before runoff enters a creek. It could be roadside ditch improvements, which often include either vegetation or rock to slow and filter water that are in roadside ditches. And you see some of our partners on these projects, which include the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Soil and Water Conservation Districts, and others. So let's look at a couple examples. So on the left is a constructed vernal pool project on our Owasco Preserve, Owasco Bluffs Preserve. This is done with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services Partners for Fish and Wildlife Program. And then on the right, you see hydroseeding done by the Onondaga County Soil and Water. This is on Bacon Hill Road, adjacent to our Staghorn Cliffs Preserve. And so that spray is basically a mix of compost and seed. And so this is at the same preserve where you saw the hydroseeding. This is the start of more vernal pool construction. So this is basically a sloping field. And this is a property purchased about 1.5 years ago by the Land Trust. And we're in the process of putting 5 vernal pools with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on this site. And so you know, right now it looks like dirt being moved, but eventually this is the idea of what it should look like. So this is an example of a vernal pool that's located on another one of our preserves in Candor that was installed 10 years ago by the Upper Susquehanna Coalition. So it's a big, to go from this to this is a bit of a, it can be tough, and that can take a decade, but these vernal pools, which create, you know, this seasonal wetland habitat, which is important for all sorts of wildlife, and also just help retain more water on our landscape. Because as we talked about, for a couple hundred years, the goal has been farming efficiency and conveying water off of land as fast and easy as possible. And at this point, we're actually trying to reverse that process a little bit and retain more of the water on the landscape. So let's look at a couple projects in the Skaneateles watershed. So on the left side, you'll see a new acquisition to our Bahar Preserve, which is just downstream adjacent to the Carpenter's Falls unique area, which is owned by DEC. And so we added a nice bit of undeveloped lakeshore. That's on the right side of that photograph. And then on the right side is a agricultural conservation easement that was closed about a year ago, featuring nice sweeping views of Skaneateles Lake. This is a map of the Skaneateles Lake watershed. You can get an idea of both the different land covers between mostly agricultural use and agriculture and forest, and you can see where a lot of our projects are. There's a couple land trust projects in the northern end, but the vast majority of projects that the land trust is working on are in the southern end of the watershed. So one, if you look at this map on the left, you can see one of a few of the projects we're working on. You can see another agricultural project all the way on the right side of that map on the left that's being worked on. That's a new easement. And then if you look at the map on the right, this new acquisition is an addition to our Hinchcliffe and High Vista preserves, which will connect these parcels of land and also provide a great recreational, more longer distance recreational opportunity. If you look at this map on the right, you see this strip of land on the top right of the right map. That is actually our Ripley Hill Connector Trail that connects to the Ripley Hill Nature Preserve, owned and managed by the Central New York Land Trust, which you'll hear from Albert later today. So basically what this will do is it will allow someone who's recreating to go from the Ripley Hill Preserve down to Hinchcliffe, and once we build this trail, get all the way to High Vista. Our goal is eventually to wrap fully around the lake and connect to Bear Swamp State Forest so that there can be a full ring of recreational opportunity as well as conservation land on the southern end of Skaneateles Lake watershed. And so last thing I'm going to play here is a little video, and I'm only going to play it for like 45 seconds. It's a little corny inspiration. And we'll take a look at this for 40 seconds or so, and then I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll take questions. Okay. Some good corny inspiration to end it. And now I'd be happy to answer any questions anyone might have. I think there was one hand raised. Let's see. So I've got the question and answer open. So first, I've got Tom Dickinson. Any plans to go from Hinchcliffe to Dickinson Conservation? This is an area where we're always looking at all the neighbors. So we do have a pending agricultural project that is north of Hinchcliffe Preserve, in that vicinity with the Dickinson Preserve, but there's no plans at this point in terms of recreation up that way. But we're continuing always to work on connecting conservation lands in that area. The second question, interested in the northern end of the Lake Thayer Park area, option to add buffers. So when rain heads down Genesee Street into the village, we have an effective way to capture runoff. Agreed. So buffers are very important, and we're instituting new buffers all the time on the properties we own or the properties we ease. But you know, working and building more buffers on more properties is going to be something that needs to be increased all the time. And so figuring out ways to get local governments and various entities involved to try to have more buffers on creeks and slow down runoff will be important in the years ahead. Tom, when will if you're referring to the agricultural project, we just actually are applying for a grant for it with the Department of Agriculture and Markets. So those are typically about a 3-year turnaround from application to closing. So a few years off. Any other questions that I've missed?
I actually have a question. So what are some of the concerns that landowners have around conservation easements and some of the barriers that land trusts might face with getting folks to have an easement on their property?
Sure. So, you know, one is just the most basic of concerns, which is that what someone is doing when they're putting an easement on their property is they are encumbering their property and getting another entity involved in their property long term. And so this is great for wildlife. It's great for conservation values, in that you basically have a organization who's a nonprofit organization whose mission is based on those ideals overseeing the property. And so oftentimes landowners are just thrilled, especially if they know they're not going to have their property that long, that the property is going to be upheld, you know, close to how it is when they put an easement on it. But at the same time, what you're doing is you are putting an easement on your property that's allowing an entity like the Finger Lakes Land Trust to monitor and enforce the terms of the easement. So if someone wanted to put an easement on their property and then decided, you know, we're not going to follow the rules of the easement, you could get into all sorts of violations and all sorts of issues related to not following the easement. So it's always that education of the landowner on what is involved in this easement and what it means for their long-term property usage is very important, because we don't want someone you know, putting an easement on their property unless they really understand what they're doing, which is limiting the uses they have for their land.
Great. I think we had a couple other questions. So Olivia says, great presentation. Thank you. Does Finger Lakes Land Trust hold conservation easements for stream buffers on farmland in the absence of any other easements on the land?
So not yet. There's actually a new program that Ag and Markets released last year that will fund that type of easement, just a buffer easement without an easement on the rest of the farm. That would actually, with that program, the lead applicant is supposed to be the Soil and Water Conservation District, and then they would partner with a land trust like Central New York Land Trust or Finger Lakes Land Trust to hold the easement. What we do in the meantime, as that program's pretty new, is for the large farm easements that we're doing, we have a designation which is called a resource protection area for the farmland easements, and that would be along the buffers and would not allow agricultural usage for buffer areas, basically. So we build that in to our easement projects, to our farmland easement projects now, even though that wasn't always done necessarily in the past.
Great. Another question is, do residents need to network with the village or town about adding buffers in the village parks near the lake? Any initial steps we can take to help?
Sure. I mean, public involvement on these items is the most valuable thing. So, now that town boards and various public meetings are done virtually, it's, I think, allowing even more people to get involved in the process and provide comments on what they feel is important in their various towns and villages. So I'd advise you to be involved and make your voice heard that you think buffers and good management on town or village owned properties is a great step for a municipality to take.
Switching over to the chat, Cynthia asks, are there incentives like tax breaks for a landowner to have their property designated as an easement?
Yeah, so this was actually, if anyone read the New York Times article, this is probably the most some folks will ever read about conservation easements, as the president has used some conservation easement tax incentives for a few of his properties, some of which an entity like Finger Lakes Land Trust might question some of the conservation value of. So that's always a question mark. But there are tax incentives. There's two. There's a state tax credit, which provides a 25% discount on property taxes. That's done every year, and that's implemented by the state DEC. So basically, when you donate an easement, your easement gets filed with New York State DEC. Let's say you pay $10,000 in taxes, you basically get a check credit of $2,500, and that's every year. The other tax incentive is this federal tax deduction, which is the one that was in the New York Times article and in the news, which is much more complicated. It's basically 50% of your income up to the value of the easement. And the value of the easement is calculated by calculating what is the full market value of a property, and then subtracting what is the value now that you've limited, encumbered it with an easement and said, 95% of this property can't be developed. What is the value of this property now? And so the difference between those two values is the value of the easement. And then the federal deduction allows you to take a 50% income deduction on that. Now, there were some changes in the 2017 tax law that makes it so you can't do both of them. It's changes to the state and local tax, the SALT state and local taxes. So basically you can choose to take the state tax credit or the federal deduction, or, and this is new, you could take a good faith valuation of the tax credit. You can do an estimate of the tax credit and reduce that from your federal tax deduction. So that's it. Property values in the Finger Lakes are not as that high, that most folks don't even do the federal tax deduction. Places that are property values are higher, it ends up becoming more of a prevalent incentive. But the thing our landowners are typically doing is the state tax credit.
Great. Another question from Sonia. She says, I live in DeWitt and get our drinking water from Skaneateles. How can surrounding municipalities leverage land restoration and conservation easements outside our town? How active is Onondaga County on the town's behalf?
So the county is very active. They have a department of the environment, which we're actually partnering with on a project on the southeastern part of Atisco Lake. How can you leverage this action? Is just being involved. You can be involved with any of the entities that are on this call, whether it's Cornell Cooperative Extension, the 2 land trusts, or SUNY ESF, and you can get involved with your towns and villages, and make comments on planning documents, attend meetings, volunteer for organizations if you want to, become educated, read about the subjects, and we're always welcome to have new volunteers and people who want to get involved all the time. So you're welcome to reach out to me anytime if you're looking for ways to get involved in these subjects.
Yeah, I'll echo what you said, Max, and say that we have volunteers at CC Onondaga, and we're always looking for suggestions for new programming and things that you all want to see and want to know more about. So feel free to reach out to me as well. Another question from Frank. Can you touch on strategies and ensuring sustainability in operations, maintenance, and monitoring of the efficacy of the protected land and its utility in protecting the watershed?
Yeah, so first off for us is making sure that when we do projects that we are making sure we're a sustainable organization. So step one is making sure that we can do the protection work. And so that means putting money in our stewardship endowment as well as our legal defense fund for every single new project that we do, so that we know that if we're taking on more conservation work, that for the long term, we're funded to be able to do the monitoring and work related to the protection of the property. In terms of restoration, it's really about partnership. It's about partnering with like-minded organizations, whether it's lake associations, Fish and Wildlife Service, universities, and making sure that that we can figure out projects that make meaningful impact on the lake. You know, so that hits like the nutrient loading side of things, but the other issue is going to be continued research and potentially figuring out a major project related to these invasive mussels, which is a whole other can of worms that will probably have to be part of any solution for aquatic blooms in the long term.
Great. Olivia Green from the Nature Conservancy put in a good point. She said the recent boil water order in DeWitt that lasted a week for most of the town is a great opportunity to raise awareness of the importance of protecting our drinking water source. So I think that's great. I'm not seeing any other questions, so I want to say a huge thank you to Max for a fabulous presentation, and I want to give folks a little break if they want to take one before the next session. Yeah, we hope to see you all at 11 a.m. for our presentation by Central New York Land Trust. And thank you very much.
All right, thank you all.
So thank you for tuning into our program this morning. Let me do this. There we go. So for those of you who are just joining us, my name is Camille Marcotte, and I'm the Water and Ecology Educator with CCE Onondaga. I just want to go over a couple quick things. So we'll have about 45 minutes for Albert's presentation and questions, and then there will be another quick 15-minute break for everyone before our last session. So let's see if I can go to the next slide. There we go. So we're using Zoom in webinar mode. So you're all muted right now and your video's off. At the end, you can use the raise hand feature to be unmuted to ask questions. But you can also type in questions in the Q&A function or the chat at any time during the presentation, and I'll be monitoring those for when we get to the end. All sessions are being recorded, and they'll be posted to the Skaneateles website and our CCE Onondaga website, and I'll share the links to those in a follow-up email as well as an evaluation form. To quickly introduce CCE Onondaga and the Skaneateles Education Program, CCE Onondaga is part of the nationwide extension system, and we have a presence in every county in New York State. Extension in New York State is run through Cornell University, and we share research-based information, resources through trainings and programs like this. We cover a variety of topics educationally. So we have 4-H, agriculture, horticulture, which is our master gardeners, nutrition, and I'm part of our natural resources program. Our Skaneateles Lake education program is funded by the city of Syracuse to provide education to help protect the water quality of Skaneateles Lake. And we do this through different workshops and programs like this one. We provide resources and information to consumers, as well as share information through our newsletters and our social media. There's also a new website for Skaneateles Lake, which was created through a partnership between all the communities in the watershed, the city of Syracuse, Onondaga Soil and Water, as well as CC Onondaga. So you can visit scanlakeinfo.org to check it out, and I'll also share that link after the presentations are over. So I'm going to introduce our next presenter, Albert Joerger. Am I saying that right, Albert?
Yes, it's like burger with a Y.
Awesome. So Dr. Albert Joerger has devoted his academic and professional life to ensuring the long-term protection of landmark and environmentally sensitive land and waterways, both in the U.S. and abroad. Albert's 2-decade career to date includes leadership positions for private nonprofits and public entities concerned with sustainable landmark environmental protection projects and initiatives that will positively impact critical ecosystems for generations to come. Albert is the executive director of the Central New York Land Trust, the 6th largest land trust in New York, protecting over 3,000 acres of land comprising 46 preserves. Albert earned his BS, MLA, and PhD from Cornell University and has been at the forefront of strategic land conservation for more than 20 years. On a personal note, Albert enjoys his free time on his family farm on Skaneateles Lake with his wife and 4 children. He and his family have enjoyed time in the Finger Lakes for 4 generations. So I will stop sharing and turn it over to Albert to take it away.
Thanks, Camille. It's a pleasure to be here today with you and Max and Sam. I'm going to work on sharing my screen. Let's see, share screen. We'll go there. Slideshow. And play from start. Can you see that?
Yep, it looks great, Albert.
Awesome. So thanks for that introduction. My name's Albert Joerger. I'm the executive director of the Central New York Land Trust, and today I'm going to talk about our work in Skaneateles Lake, as well as our Watershed Education Center. So thank you very much. This is what it's all about. We're working to save the lake. Watershed protection, environmental conservation, land protection, both in easement and fee. That was a great description of the easement process that Max went through earlier. So thanks for that, Max. And we are razor focused on watershed protection, both for environmental conservation and for our recreation. Great news, we just got a huge gift. We got a $2.2 million gift for watershed protection and for outdoor recreation. So we're really excited for Dr. Vitkus's donation and for those funds that will be established. So pretty awesome. The mission of the Central New York Land Trust. The Central New York Land Trust seeks to preserve and protect natural areas in order to provide communities with clean water, clean air, wildlife habitat, and very importantly, a chance to connect with the land. If people can't connect with the land, it's really hard to get them excited about conserving it. We were founded in 1972. We're a member-supported nonprofit land conservation organization. We have about a 1,750 square mile service area here in Central New York, and we're supported by about 350 organizations, individuals, and families. So you can see here, it's the boundaries of our service area. It's really the watersheds of the lakes in Onondaga and Oswego counties. We have offices at 7 Fennel Street, 3 full-time staff, and 14 board members. Here's just a quick, a listing of our 46 preserves. Some highlights in terms of the Skaneateles Valley Preserve, the Riverwalk, Elbridge Swamp, where we're actually going to have our first our beta test on hunting for deer management. Three Falls Woods, Brickyard Falls. We've done a ton of work over there in terms of conserving waterfalls and their watersheds, funded by a fellow named Harold Jones, who's an awesome local conservationist. Very grateful to him. We of course have Baltimore Woods, which was one of our first preserves, and we conserve that in partnership with Baltimore Woods Nature Center Inc. They're an awesome partner. Pleasant Valley, which is one of our newest preserves, Old Fly Marsh, High Hickory Wildlife Sanctuary, Ripley Hill, which we did it was a gift actually from the Finger Lakes Land Trust, and we're very grateful for that. South Meadows, Tracy Lake, and Whitney Hollow are all great places to come and visit. In terms of our programs, we have 3 program areas: land protection, land stewardship, and education and outreach. In terms of land protection, we of course have to identify parcels for conservation. And in terms of our initiatives, we're looking at growing our existing preserves and then identifying areas with either important rare and endangered species, important for watershed protection or important for recreation. We have to make sure that we have funds to be able to move forward with those and or conservation-minded landowners. So we either have to do fundraising or find donors, landowners who want to donate their lands. Usually it's a bit of a hybrid of those two. Once we identify a piece of land, we jump in and do some of our due diligence. We look at environmental phase 1s, we look at inventories, and then we do our sort of nuts and bolts due diligence for title and survey work, and then we move forward with a purchase. In terms of land stewardship, we are super fortunate. We have 147 volunteers as part of our stewardship program, and we have 2 awesome co-chairs of our stewardship committee. So we have this fellow named Jack Gramlich and Catherine Landis. I think Jack's been stewarding land for the Central New York Land Trust as a volunteer, I think as long as we've existed. So he just has a hands-on knowledge of everything, and Catherine has a depth of academic knowledge. So we're very grateful for both of them. They do everything from managing for watershed management, trail maintenance, boardwalk building, boundary posting. We've had a big push recently for some additional parking at our preserves. With the advent of COVID, there's been a real surge in interest in visiting our preserves, and we're trying to accommodate guests for that. And then, very, very important, all of our preserves get monitored each year, and then we try and inform the public who's visiting with kiosks and signs. Stewardship's a really critical part of what we do. And then education and outreach. We have a director of programs, Lori Walker. We have our big focus on watershed education. We have both our Watershed Education Center here in Skaneateles at 7 Fennel Street, and then our annex, our Outdoor Watershed Education Center at our High Hickory preserves. Along with it, in our education outreach, we do preserve walks. We have educational speakers. We had a great program that we partnered with Cornell and a few other partners on woolly adelgid and their potential impact on the Skaneateles Lake watershed. We've had preserve management meetings, and then it's kind of all about trying to create the next generation of conservationists. So we have 3 preserves in the Skaneateles Lake watershed. We have our Snow Creek Ravine, we have Ripley Hill, and our High Hickory Wildlife Sanctuary. This is our Ripley Hill Preserve. It's the highest point in the Skaneateles Lake watershed, the 3rd highest point in Onondaga County. The really cool thing I think about the Ripley Hill Preserve, besides it being spectacularly beautiful and an awesome partnership between 2 great land trusts, is it's part of 3 watersheds, and it kind of really puts a spotlight on what we have to think about when we think about watershed management. But it's part of the Skaneateles Lake watershed, the Otisco Lake watershed, and part of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And so when there's a possibility that a raindrop could fall on one particular spot on this site and maybe go to 3 places. So that's kind of exciting. In terms of the conservation values that we're trying to protect here, it's really watershed protection, forest resources, of course, outdoor recreation, which is very important organizationally to us. Agricultural conservation, there's fields on the property. And then really interestingly, there's a unique hemlock swamp on the property. And it's really fun to see sort of any time of year. And if you take the hike from Ripley Hill down to the Hinchcliffe Family Preserve, you can experience some of that. So here's a map of the preserve. It's you can see forest to the north and to the west, and then the hatched area are agricultural fields that right now are in Meadow, and then the red line is the connector trail over to the Ripley, over to the Hinchcliffe Family Preserve. The whole preserve is about 109 acres. It's located in the town of Spatford in Onondaga County, and we conserved this property in 2011. I thought it might be kind of fun. Here's the signage and the marker for the trail going out, but it might be kind of fun to sort of go on a little hike of the preserve, going through some photos. So you can see these wonderful meadows in the forest edge, big sky, which is really exciting. And, where you park, you have a lot of this large field areas. You can see the Queen Anne's Lace in the foreground there. Then you have the access to the trail that connects down to the Hinchcliffe Family Preserve, and you go through some wet areas, then into some hemlock forests, and then down. And one of the highlights, and I would encourage anyone who spends time in the Finger Lakes to go and check this out. There's a bench that's on that trail, and when you sit in that bench, you can experience this view, and it's awesome. It really kind of brings to light why all of us are working on this important resource, Skaneateles Lake, and it just makes such an impression. And I would encourage everyone who hasn't been out there to check it out, and anyone who's been out there, go again. I don't know. I never tire of it. It's really it's one of those sacred places. Next, we have our Snow Creek Ravine. We conserved Snow Creek Ravine in 1998. It's more in the north end of the lake, and it's just over 7 acres. It's right off of East Lake Road. It's a combination of field and forest. We've tried to do some reforestation out there. In terms of conservation values, it works for watershed protection, forest and grassland areas, and it's about 3 miles from the village. Fantastic fall color. You can see the stream corridor there that we're protecting from sediment with forested buffers. There's another view of the site, and again, working on maintaining the forest canopy, maintaining water quality. And then you move away from the stream, and you have some reforestation and some meadow areas. And we don't have public access to that site. If there was someone who was interested, they could call us and we could make an appointment for them to visit. There's some neighbors in proximity to the site, and a condition of the gift was that it be by appointment only. And then lastly, really exciting, our High Hickory Wildlife Sanctuary. We recently did a bunch of enhancements out there to allow for greater visitation. We conserved High Hickory Wildlife Sanctuary in 1989. It was a gift of 3 doctors. They were super progressive people who had bought the site originally. Actually, they were thinking of a development. And then as they spent time on the site, they were just moved to see it conserved. It's been a part of the history of the Central New York Land Trust, for decades. One year on Earth Day, we released a hawk there as part of the Earth Day celebrations, and we're forever grateful for those 3 doctors and their generous gift to the community of the High Hickory Wildlife Sanctuary. It's 92 acres, and probably most importantly, it's adjacent to Lord's Camp, so it's really part of a much larger block of conservation land. It's part of the 10 Mile Creek Watershed, and in terms of conservation values that are protected there, there's, of course, watershed protection, wetlands, waterfalls. There's beautiful forest. If you ever want to, you park in the parking area and you head south, and you end up coming to, and I'll have some photos of it later, these wonderful streams with these geologic formations called eskers that are in between. And you get up onto the 2nd or 3rd esker as you head south, which it's a pretty vigorous hike, and you really feel like you were transported to the Adirondacks. So it's pretty spectacular, and it raises some really serious questions for watershed protection, because you really get a sense of how important the hemlock tree is to the structure of our forest in the Finger Lakes, or at least here on Skaneateles Lake. And one wonders, as we look at infestation of woolly adelgid and the impact that's going to have, what that's going to look like, and what kind of solutions we're going to have to come up with. So here's a map of the site. The entrance is by the P. We have since brought a new driveway in and parking area that brings you into the pond. The site is going to have a series of improvements for watershed protection. It has some really cool. This is a kettle that's in one of the stream corridors. You can see the new access drive that comes into the site. It'll allow more folks, like people with mobility issues, and also will allow for greater visitation with social distancing. We're really excited. That was paid for with a grant from the Central New York Community Foundation, and we're super grateful to their investment in our outdoor watershed education center. There you can see the view of the new parking area. We're all about partnership. This is one of our partners, Mark Berger, Onondaga County Soil and Water Conservation District. And he's standing atop. You really get a sense how he's standing atop one of these eskers. And so to his left and right are precipitous drops that go down into stream beds, and really a special part of the High Hickory Wildlife Sanctuary. And I would encourage anyone with time and the physical stamina to go and really check it out. We spend a bunch of time out there. We have some amphibious friends who spend time in the eskers, and there's I'm not sure if I'm supposed to say this, but there's great mushrooms out there. This is I think it's Animenta. And then I've also seen some chanterelles out there. Really high quality habitat. And then more specifically, we have our Central New York Land Trust Watershed Center, and that's over at 7 Fennell Street in Skaneateles. We have, again, great partners on that. We have the Community Foundation of Central New York. We have the Skaneateles Lake Association, Onondaga County Soil and Water, SUNY ESF, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Nature Conservancy, and the Lockheed Martin Employee Fund. We're super proud of the Watershed Center. The Central New York has one combined watershed initiative. We're looking at the Watershed Center at 7 Fennell Street, which is where folks can come and get briefed on issues surrounding a conservation with a watershed focus. And then we have our High Hickory Outdoor Watershed Center, and that has demonstrations of best management practices. So working on things like water diversions and corduroy bridges, vernal ponds. And we'd really like to see, as part of our initiative, to grow the conservation area over there around High Hickory. So we'd like to see, through a combination of land acquisition, conservation easements, and landowner education, to see a network of protected land and managed for water quality and environmental diversity. In terms of our Watershed Center, it starts out at 40,000 feet. It talks about, what watersheds are, and it uses the Skaneateles Lake watershed as an example. It talks about the different kind of how land is owned and how it's used in the watershed. Specifically in Skaneateles Lake watershed, 52% of it is private land or residential. There's 37% that's agricultural, 9% that's public, and 2% commercial. And it just kind of paints a picture of the watershed, and then information about specifically about Skaneateles and the surrounding communities. We look in general at watersheds, their functions, and then the human impacts on watersheds, and go through specific examples. We were super fortunate. We had SUNY ESF grad students who helped us develop this outreach information, and we're incredibly grateful for all of their good work. And then focusing down on Skaneateles Lake watershed, it's been a source of some of the cleanest water since the 1890s. It's really kind of an engineering feat. Skaneateles Lake feeds the city of Syracuse by gravity, and how cool is that that was all sorted out, over 100 years ago, and the system still functions well today. As we look at watershed management, we of course enter into the HABs conversation, and it's really important to talk about harmful algal blooms. And there's a ton of discussion and research going on, and we of course are not a research organization, but we are certain that that land management practices around the lake either impact current HAB blooms or will impact future HAB blooms. So there's only positive benefits that can come out of conserving and restoring land around the lake, and promoting conservation, both through conservation easements, through education and outreach, and through land acquisition to give the lake the greatest opportunity to maintain the quality that it's so well known for. We touched briefly on the human impacts and climate change and the role that land trust can play. in terms of smart communities and work on both, increasing forest cover and looking at, clustering development and managing stormwater and, trying to limit heat islands. There's a ton that can be done, and it's an opportunity when the public comes to visit us to be able to reach out and have that discussion. And then we talk about ecosystem services, trees, soil, wildlife, water. There's a ton of ecosystem services that are offered to the greater Central New York community from Skaneateles Lake and the Skaneateles Lake Watershed. The lake not only offers tourism and community revitalization benefits, but also there's, timber production in the watershed, food production. There's employment from, from everything from recreational industries, agriculture, banking, design, and also some renewable energy. And it's just really important to look at what the ecosystem services are of this incredible resource. And then as we talk about conservation of the resource, bring that into focus. We talk about best management practices and talk about what people can do as they look at their own particular sites and look at the effects of deforestation, urbanization on agriculture, waterways, and again the heat islands. So again, trying to bring a resource for the community to come to bring these issues to top of mind. You can't really talk about the landscape without talking about agriculture in the Skaneateles Lake watershed. And there's been huge changes in agriculture over time, and how do we work with agricultural producers to both enhance production, safeguard the lake, maintain habitat for the species that exist here. A lot of our landscapes are pretty fragmented. The species that are here have thrived in those fragmented landscapes. There is the question when do you get to the point of too much fragmentation, and working with conservation easements and land acquisition is a great way to slow that fragmentation process. And even here in Skaneateles, we have issues of urbanization. There's urbanization throughout the watershed, or greater development pressure, and then you have green infrastructure, looking at forestry practices, green roofs, looking at permeable pavements. Some of the issues that were brought up in some of the questions: what can we do in the village in terms of working with the village of Skaneateles to improve water quality in the north end of the lake. There's just a ton of opportunities, and creating awareness about these opportunities is what our watershed center is about. We then discuss what Land Trust can offer in terms of solution, because these watershed issues are these huge complex problems, and Land Trust can offer a very definitive solution to a portion of the issues faced by the Skaneateles Lake watershed. It's exciting that we have two very competent land trusts here in the watershed, and they can offer things like buffers to stream corridors. They can offer easements that promote farming best practices. They can offer special wildlife habitat, habitat for amphibians, for grassland birds. They can help to create. They can help to create clean drinking water, and so there's just a ton of activities that are land-based that Land Trust can offer, can provide assistance with. It's important to recognize that Land Trust can provide a wealth of ecological and economic benefits that extend beyond cost-effective climate mitigation. So there's just a whole basket of services that Land Trust can offer. We do some high, a beginner information, talk about what is open space in the United States, and then open space specifically in New York, and then around Skaneateles Lake. We define open space as land which is not intensively developed for residential, commercial, or industrial or institutional use. It can be public or private, and it includes areas such as wetlands, parks, water bodies, such as Skaneateles Lakes and the shoreline. And then we talk about how conservation is done, both with land acquisition, with conservation easements, and how there are these spheres of influence in protecting, endangered species, preventing impact into floodplains, promoting best management practices. There's just a whole wheelhouse of information that's offered, and we can partner with landowners, we partner with local governments, we partner with other land trusts, with other nonprofit organizations. So there's just a ton that we can do in terms of conservation efforts, and that Land Trust can be the catalyst for. And then specifically our High Hickory Outdoor Watershed Education Center, we are offering an opportunity that people can get out in the landscape. The parking area out there will hold like 30 cars. We can have school groups come and visit. So far, our completed tasks out there is we have the driveway installed. We've done invasive plant treatment, and we have done our first seeding with warm season grasses. So it's pretty exciting. It's interesting to see. It's just starting to sprout. We need a little more rain. We've done a handful of outreach programs out there, including our woolly adelgid outreach program that we partnered with Cornell. We started at our Watershed Center here on Fennell Street, and we did an hour program there that talked about identifying and managing woolly adelgid, and then we went out for a hike to look for woolly adelgid on the site. It appears as though the woolly adelgid is coming up 10 Mile Creek from Lord's Camp and up into the valley. So it's going to be a big issue that we're going to have to address. We have partnered with a group of organizations, including Skaneateles Lake Association, Soil and Water, to work on a grant to manage a woolly adelgid on the site. In terms of future enhancements, we're hoping to add an informational kiosk, to add some vernal ponds, create some snags to slow water flow. It's all about slowing the water flow, getting sediment to come out, and installing a corduroy bridge, and then enhancing our trails, creating. We're working with Soil and Water to create water deflection, and they've been, as they have also been helpful to the Finger Lakes Land Trust. They've done some hydroseeding out on the site for us, as we did our enhanced driveway cut. I just would encourage everyone, in general, but particularly in the time of COVID, we have 2 preserves in the Skaneateles Lake watershed that you can visit. We have probably 16 or 20 other preserves that are also have developed parking areas and trail systems. If one of our other preserves catches your imagination, you'd like to visit it, just give us a call, and we can help you with visitation instructions. You know, in terms of ways to get involved, I'd say become a member or a volunteer. There's a great esprit de corps in our volunteer organization. You know, 147 folks. There's you know, there's someone for everyone, and it's a fun group to be part of. They meet on a regular basis at different preserves and, you know, build boardwalks, move stones. They did a Earth Day tree planting. It's really awesome to see, and a fun thing to be a part of. You can call our office and get more information about that. The last piece of our Watershed Center, we invite people to become citizen scientists, and we try and offer links that they might be able to get more involved. And then lastly, I'd just like to thank everyone for their time today. It's awesome to be here in Skaneateles, and great to be part of conserving such an important natural resource for the community. So thank you very much, and I'm open for questions.
Great, thank you, Albert. Let's see, we have one question that I see in the Q&A right now, which is, what is being done now to preserve and protect the hemlock forests?
So we had done some preliminary inventory work at the High Hickory Preserve. I know Lord's Camp has done some work. There was along with our program, there was a program that was offered at the Skaneateles Library about woolly adelgid. And there was a group of partners that got together, including Skaneateles Lake Association. I think the Soil and Water Conservation District is part of it. Cornell might be part of it. And to look at both monitoring and treatment. So the thought for right now is to treat the trees. I think the treatment happens like about once every 5 years, and to treat the trees and then figure out if there's an alternative. You know, when you look at these majestic hemlocks that are in the Skaneateles Lake watershed, and you try and think like, well, what's next, and what's that transition going to look like? You know, it really makes you warm up to the idea of at least treatment for the time being, because you know, I'm not sure we have a concrete idea of what that transition would look like, and then what kind of what tree species would take the place of the hemlock. And you know, it's just one of those challenging stories of invasive species.
Yeah, just to add on to that too, I know there's a lot of researchers that are looking right now at trees that could replace hemlocks. And there's also the New York State Hemlock Initiative, which is run through Cornell University, and they've done some work in the southern portion of the Skaneateles watershed, and they're really focused on a biocontrol. So actually an insect from the Pacific Northwest that could help with controlling hemlock woolly adelgid. So those are kind of some of the things that are happening in the background in terms of research, but right now, like Albert said, it's mostly just treating the trees. I actually had another question that was emailed to me. They asked kind of what distinguished the area covered by Finger Lakes Land Trust versus Central New York Land Trust.
Yeah, that's a great question. So our focus is on the lands and waters of the lakes in Onondaga and Oswego County. And so Skaneateles and Otisco Lake are really fortunate that there's this overlap of service areas. So, you know, there's so much conservation work to be done that it's great that we have, you know, it's great that we have the Finger Lakes Land Trust, who's an awesome partner of ours. We have Cornell, we have ESF, we have, you know, we have the Nature Conservancy with offices over in Auburn. We have Ducks Unlimited. God, I'm going to miss someone, and I'm going to, you know, but there's just a great group of folks with a great field of knowledge and experience that are working to save, you know, in my mind, I guess it might be one of the most important lakes. important lakes on earth. It's I love having our family farm on the lake, and we have great recreation, and the lake serves it serves so many different constituencies. It serves the people of Syracuse with clean drinking water. It serves folks in the village for boating recreation and scenic vistas. It serves hunters and fishermen as recreationists. So there's just it's a real gem, and I'm thrilled that there's so many folks working to conserve it.
Great. I don't see any more questions, but I actually wanted to ask if you had any plans to acquire any other land in the Skaneateles Lake watershed.
We're working diligently to identify new parcels. We'd like to grow the island around our existing preserves in the watershed, and I think science would back it up that bigger patches are better than small patches, and so I think that we just received a really exciting grant or gift of $2.2 million. A good portion of that will go towards land acquisition. And that land acquisition, as it looks, most likely will be in the Skaneateles Lake watershed. So there'll be some exciting announcements to come forth, hopefully, in the coming, I don't know if it'll take 12 or 24 months. As Max pointed out, the acquisition process can be long and onerous.
Great. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions, so I just want to say a huge thank you to Albert for that wonderful presentation. I loved your highlighting of recreation and giving us some visual images of the preserves. I know I've been there and it's beautiful, but hopefully to get some other folks out there. So thank you very much, Albert, and
Come visit us.
we will take another 15-minute break and come back for Sam's presentation at noon. If you are just joining us, if you have stuck around, thank you for tuning in so far, and this is our last presentation of the day. I promise this is the last time you'll have to hear me do all these introductions if you've stuck around. But my name is Camille Marcotte, and I'm the water and ecology educator with Cornell Cooperative Extension in Onondaga County. We are using Zoom in webinar mode. So you all are muted right now. There's no background noise. However, if you would like to ask a question through audio, you can use the raise hand feature and I can unmute you. We're gonna hold all questions until the end, but feel free to type in any questions that you have throughout the presentation into the Q&A or chat functions. If you want to ask a question anonymously, you can do that through the Q&A function. All of these sessions will be recorded and they'll be posted to the Skaneateles website as well as our Cornell Cooperative Extension Onondaga County website. And I will share the URLs for presentations in an email as well as a evaluation. So just to quickly introduce Cornell Cooperative Extension Onondaga County and the Skaneateles Education Program. CCE Onondaga is part of the nationwide extension system, which is through Cornell University here in New York State. CCE has a presence in every single county in New York State in some shape or other. We share research-based information through trainings and programs like this, and we cover a variety of different topics. Our office has 4-H, agriculture, horticulture, nutrition, and natural resources programs. The Skaneateles Lake Education Program is funded by the City of Syracuse to provide education to protect water quality in Skaneateles Lake. So we do this through offering trainings and programs like this one, providing resources and information to people who reach out, and sending information and updates on the lake and water quality through our newsletters, listservs, and social media. And there's also a new website for Skaneateles Lake, which was created through a partnership between the local watershed communities, City of Syracuse, Onondaga Soil and Water, and CCE Onondaga So you can visit scanlakeinfo.org to check it out. And you also, if you live in the watershed, will probably get a postcard about the website in the next week or so. So I will now introduce our last presenter, Sam Quinn. So Sam is a researcher and instructor at the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry. He is a member of ESF's Restoration Science Center, where he focuses on the center's Conservation on Private Lands initiative. Sam's research and teaching center on the role of private landowners in efforts to enhance habitat to preserve and promote biodiversity. So I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Sam to take it away.
Oh, hi everyone. Bring up my screen here. We're all becoming Zoom experts. And I'm going to do my very best to keep this presentation to 45 minutes because today I get to talk about one of my favorite things in the world that all of my colleagues are probably sick to death of me talking about, and that's the creation of meadows. As Camille introduced me, I am a member of the the Restoration Science Center at SUNY ESF, and I'm really happy to be able to speak in the same presentation as Max and Albert and hear all about all of the great things the Finger Lakes Land Trust has been doing, the CNY Land Trust has been doing. And I'm lucky because I get to focus on a very specific type of project today. And before I talk more about meadows and the other work that I do, I just want to mention that the Lawn to Meadow program is something that grew organically because of interest from landowners around Skaneateles and other areas that came to us for advice on how to create these meadows, how to eat up some of the lawn area that they know is having a detrimental effect to the environment. And still, this is just one piece of the Restoration Science Center's offering in the science that we do. Very briefly, I do want to just give a quick overview of all of the rest of the great work the Restoration Science Center does. We have a global presence focusing on major initiatives like ecosystem restoration, such as the lawn to meadow work we'll talk about today, but also imperiled ecosystems like inland salt marshes. We have nearly 4 faculty members involved, and they bring various expertise like James Gibbs's work with Galapagos giant tortoises, Bill Powell's work restoring the American chestnut to the landscape. We also engage in biocultural restoration, ways to connect people to the land, to become more conscientious and empowered stewards of their land. And finally, agroecological restoration, using the power of agriculture to restore landscape in traditionally rural areas, but also in urban areas to help people gain access to healthy food and use these species to restore degraded areas in our urban cities. So, without further ado, I do want to tell you just a bit about myself. I went to ESF as a student years ago. I did my undergrad and grad work there, and then I left to become a land manager in Northern Virginia. Spending about 7 years there, I worked on all sorts of restoration projects with various different habitats, but most often I worked in creating and maintaining these meadows. So I have a lot of experience doing this. I've designed from the ground up about 13 or 14 meadows, and I've advised on the creation and management of many more. I just happen to be an expert in this one thing, and I'm so happy I get to talk about it today with you. So very briefly, I want to go over what we'll cover. Basically, we'll start with why lawns are bad. Then we'll move on to why meadows are good. And a very quick overview of the establishment and maintenance process behind these meadows. Many of you may be thinking about doing this with your own land, and I just want to give you a very broad overview of how this process works so you can begin thinking more about it. And to be clear, what ESF through the Restoration Science Center wants to do is to provide landowners guidance on how they may be able to use their land to enhance and preserve biodiversity. So we don't do the work of, let's say, clearing vegetation and seeding meadows, but we will help you think about which plant species can be most advantageous for your local biodiversity and walk you through the process so you have a better understanding of how to approach it. And most importantly, we want to follow up this work with research to engage students and scientists by studying the effect of lawn to meadow conversion on water quality and local biodiversity. So we are so happy to be able to engage with you all on this exciting project. I'm not being hyperbolic when I say that lawns may be among the greatest threats to biodiversity. There's many reasons for this. Lawns, at least the way we have them here in the United States, are dominated by largely exotic species of grass and flower like white clover. To maintain these species and the lush look that they have, lawns typically require enormous inputs of water and other amendments like fertilizer. The mowers and weed eaters we use to manage lawns frequently are incredible sources of CO2 and other pollutants that contribute to the atmospheric gases that affect our personal health and to climate change. And lawns are notorious for encouraging the overuse and misuse of pesticides and herbicides to maintain these exotic species, which are not really adapted to our climates. They need a lot of help to look nice. Most importantly, though, lawns represent a tremendous loss of habitat. Habitat loss is far and away, more than climate change, more than invasive species, more than spreading novel diseases. Habitat loss is the biggest threat to global biodiversity. And lawns are, in essence, a biological desert. Very few things can live in them. This includes the soil community. Worms, maybe, but the abundance and diversity of soil organisms beneath a meadow or other natural native habitat is far greater than in these artificial lawns. So I'm a scientist and I like to quantify things. Let's put this into perspective. How much lawn is there in the United States? So let's focus on the lower 48. There's approximately just under 3 million square miles of contiguous land in the lower 48. All right. Let's compare lawns to something we all think about, national parks. So within this area, there's approximately 42,000 square miles of national parks, or just under 1.5% of the total area. Okay, let's talk about lawns. A study from NASA about 5 years ago estimates about 63,000 square miles of lawn in the same area. Now, even if this is on the high end within the margin of error, that's still about as much land as in all of the national parks put together. Think about that. Here's another image showing concentrations of lawns. Landowners have the potential to create as much area of high quality habitat as we already have in national parks. Now look, I'm realistic. I'm not saying that, oh, everyone's going to convert 100% of their lawn to wildlife habitat. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the enormous good that private landowners can do as agents of conservation. And that's why I'm so happy to be part of the Private Lands Initiative in the Restoration Science Center to study the effects of private landowners and private land on conservation efforts. Again, we don't need to eliminate all of our lawn. Our dogs need places to play. We want to play catch. We want to have picnics. But think about it strategically. Are there pieces of your property that you would rather not mow, that you would rather have beautiful grasses and wildflowers that support thriving communities of invertebrates and birds and other beloved species of wildlife? So to talk about a meadow, let's make sure we're on the same page. As a scientist, I tend to use very specific language, and I'm being very general when I talk about meadows. I'm really talking about a plant community composed of flowers and grasses with few woody plants, so no trees, no shrubs. We're kind of focused on upland meadows today. Few people have a lawn that they would consider a wetland, but meadows can be wet as well. So I'm being very general when I use the word meadow. Importantly, meadows can support very high biodiversity, a high diversity of plant life, a high diversity of soil organisms, and a high diversity of insects and the species that eat them. Meadows also generate valuable ecosystem services for humans. Now, an ecosystem service is something nature does for us to contribute to our economy for free. Think about the rains that water our crops. And importantly for landowners, meadows can be far less expensive to maintain than a traditional lawn and an absolutely beautiful landscape feature. Now, I say can be. Us scientists have the annoying habit of starting every sentence with the words, "it depends," and that's true. A lot of what you'll see today is a generalization. Everyone's site is different. Everyone's objectives are different. So please don't take away from this that I'm telling you, oh, you'll absolutely save money or you'll absolutely support grassland birds. These are generalizations, and I'm happy to speak with you afterwards and individually about your specific needs and what you may want to do with your property. Rather than keep talking about meadows, let me just show you. Here's a meadow that I made several years ago in Virginia, and you'll notice that it is absolutely swarming with life. You can see this pink flower is bee balm, Monarda fistulosa. There's a eastern tiger swallowtail butterfly. Notice as I play this short clip, how many plants, the clouds of beneficial insects, these pollinators and crop pest predators that help control pests on the farm where this meadow was created. The diversity of insects is tremendous. Notice here, this is actually a moth, a hummingbird moth, also called a northern clearwing. These species cannot live in a lawn, which is essentially a sterile environment. They need a diversity of flowers, a diversity of grasses to drink nectar, eat pollen, and eat the plant material themselves. This is why we do what we do, to create the first linkages in a healthy and diverse food chain. I think the easiest example to make the connection between these habitats and the plants they support and the wildlife we love would be to think about monarchs. As caterpillars, monarchs are specially adapted to eating plants in the milkweed family, like these common milkweeds. Adult butterflies, monarchs, and many other pollinators will drink the nectar from milkweed flowers. Meadows are disappearing from the landscape very rapidly. And imagine the challenges faced by monarch caterpillars migrating from the tip of North America all the way down to Mexico. They depend on patches of wildflowers on their journey to eat food, and more wildflowers in meadows are disappearing as we replace them with lawn and agriculture and suburban sprawl. There are other lesser known examples of these intimate associations between animals and plants. This plant has maybe the coolest name of any plant. It's called rattlesnake master, and it supports the rattlesnake master borer moth, a moth that depends on this species as a caterpillar. That moth was recently attempted to be listed on the Federal Endangered Species Act. It is disappearing as the meadows that support rattlesnake master are disappearing. I don't believe it made listing for some technicality, but still, there are thousands of stories like the monarch caterpillar that the public just isn't aware of, tied to the disappearance of these meadows. Structurally, these habitats are important as well. And by structurally, I mean literally the three-dimensional shape. Imagine a two-dimensional meadow, a two-dimensional lawn, a flat surface of short grasses. Even if we don't mow lawns, even if we let them grow 4, 5, 6 inches, the structure of those plant materials are different from those of our native meadow species. Notice the robust grasses and flowers in this image of an ice storm. They create pockets of shelter in harsh weather conditions that small birds and other wildlife species can protect themselves from. If this were a lawn, there was no shelter. That's it, they're done. Meadows are also highly drought resistant. These species have roots that extend deep into the soil. Our turfgrass species and even bunch grasses used in meadows, they have roots that maybe go down a few inches, maybe up to a foot in some situations. But meadow species have roots that extend 8, 10, 12, or even 14 feet into the soil, limited only by the depth to bedrock in many areas. This meadow is thriving with plant diversity. I can see dozens of grass and flower species in this image, and here's the same area months later in a heavy drought. And by heavy drought, I mean looking at the weather data that I had on a station at this property, we were 10 inches short of rain compared to the historic averages. And still the plants flower, still the site is lush, no watering necessary. A lawn would be a brown mess at this point and require enormous inputs of water on an already stressed system. To summarize the many ecosystem services that these meadows can provide, here's an image of many different meadows. In the foreground, we have one that is low growing, very sparse, intentionally so to support grassland birds like grasshopper sparrows. In the center left of the image is a golden swath That gold color is Coreopsis tinctoria, plains Coreopsis. That meadow was designed to be very dense and full of flowers to support a thriving pollinator and crop pest community that would perform services in the agricultural field just beyond that meadow. And I'm not just saying that. If you can notice, it's very difficult to see. There is a little white tent in the middle of that meadow. I worked with the USDA and the Smithsonian to sample these beneficial insect communities within the meadow, on the border of the meadow in the agricultural field, and right in the agricultural field to see, are these ecosystems exporting these ecosystem services as we hope they are? And yes, indeed, these populations are going into the agricultural area and having these beneficial effects. On the right of the image, there is a tall grass meadow. And by tall, I mean some of these grasses grow 7 or 8 feet in height. That meadow was installed to line a stream that feeds the irrigation ponds in the center of the image. Those ponds water all of the crops that we grow in this organic farm. Prior to establishing these meadows, the landscape was a tightly mowed pasture, similar to a lawn. The water quality in these ponds was very poor. I know this because I measured it for years. We even had fish kills. After establishing the meadow, after establishing this dense plant cover with tons of biomass underground to hold and filter the soil, the water quality improved dramatically. If you're thinking about converting your lawn to a meadow or a portion of it, you should know that meadows are dynamic ecosystems. They're not stable like lawns are. They don't always look the same. And to me, this is one of the most incredible aspects. Much like a forest, meadows evolve over years. They change color and texture with seasons. Even throughout one day, the effects of weather can change the appearance of a meadow dramatically. You should also know that as a landowner interested in this, you have a great deal of control over what a meadow looks like in terms of height and color and all of these other aesthetic elements that are really important when managing land on private property. And now I get to show you just some examples of meadows that I've created or work with and how they change over seasons to whet your appetite for what may be possible with your own land. This meadow in northeastern Pennsylvania in June is dominated by Penstemon digitalis, these white flowers, and you can see some of the purple Tradescantia spiderworts. This time of year, the meadows are bright white and purple. In July, you see all the colors of the rainbow and more. In the foreground, there's yellow oxeye sunflower. In the back, you can see the swath of white is big-tooth mountain mint. The shades of purpley misty material are the seed heads of bent grasses. You can achieve anything you want, just like painting a picture. Zooming in, you can see the abundance of insect life. 3 species of bumblebees in this picture alone. We sampled them this day, so we pretty sure we know exactly what we're talking about. I'm not trying to exaggerate. This culver's root is beloved by insects. They cover it and then they pollinate the farm that occurs on this property. This time of year, yellows from goldenrods and purples from asters dominate. Much like the foliage of our autumn trees, these meadows can change color and almost seem to reflect it like a pond. I think these meadows are perhaps the most attractive in fall and winter. Another example from where I worked as a land manager in Virginia, this meadow in July with a variety of colors, and then almost the same location in November, showing that these areas still have character, still provide shelter for wildlife all throughout the year. Another area of the same property now in September, we see a meadow that is intentionally designed to be short. There's no species here that exceed 2.5 inches in height. The reason for that is you can see a fence in the background on the right. We have horses and we didn't want them eating this vegetation. I put this image in to illustrate the control you have over the look of these ecosystems. I also wanted to point out this cloudy substance is not a smudge on the lens. That's actually the seed head of big-top lovegrass. Big-top lovegrass, as with many of the Eragrostis grass species, has a big billowy seed head that in certain weather conditions catches mist and seems to sparkle and create a fog haze on the top of the meadow. Again, an ephemeral look that you only get sometimes, but when you see it and experience it, it's special. Again, in fall, there is so much structure, so much character. I might be a little crazy and maybe spend too much time in these meadows, but I feel like I can tell the difference in the sound the wind makes between a meadow composed of these diverse native species and a tall lawn. So to walk you through some of the thought process on designing a meadow, it's important to recognize what your own objectives are, right? My objectives as a conservation biologist center on enhancing biodiversity by creating these meadows. You know, of course, I want them to be beautiful, right? You may have your own objectives. It could be simply reducing the amount of area that you mow and saving money that way, promoting particular beloved taxa like butterflies and birds, or just creating a landscape feature that will be the envy of your neighbors. An example of designing meadows for biodiversity is by ensuring consistent bloom time and nectar flow of these plant communities all year. Here's an example of a bumblebee drinking from a bee balm flower. This flower blooms in midsummer, and once it finishes blooming and begins to go dormant for the year, this species, Monarda punctata, dotted mint, will begin to bloom. Similar flower, still usable by long-tongued bees like these bumblebees and butterflies. So there is always a consistent food availability for these species. They have all of their needs met all year. In general, there are a few main steps to establishing a meadow. And again, we're specifically talking about converting lawns to meadows in this presentation. You of course need to clear the existing vegetation and then apply the seed mix, so sow these seeds. And finally, maintain the meadow. In the first year to 2 years, there's a bit more work than would be following, but there is a small investment in time and labor to managing a meadow. Nothing compared to the constant mowing of a lawn, but this is not a completely hands-off process, and I'll explain why in a bit. So first, clearing vegetation. Now, normally what you do when you clear vegetation is balance the potential environmental harm you could do by disturbing the land with the effectiveness of whatever methods you choose. Cost is also an important factor for a lot of people. There are many methods available. I could go into tremendous detail with all of these methods, and I do a whole course where I spend days talking about each one in granular detail. Suffice it to say, there are lots of techniques available. Examples include tilling, so repeated disturbance of the soil that shreds the existing vegetative cover and disturbs the seed bank to drag up more seeds, and then till them again over and over again until you finally kill the existing vegetation. You could also scour the top layer of soil off, removing the existing vegetation and any of the seeds in the seed bank. And the seed bank is the sum total of seeds that are waiting for the right conditions to germinate. Let's say you decide to till some soil. Well, you could eliminate your grass and then get a much worse problem when very, very aggressive invasive species show up because they've been waiting. Herbicides are probably the most commonly used technique to clear vegetation for meadows. Normally it's, well, it's not normally, but almost entirely glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup. Now, again, I'm not suggesting using one of these methods. I'm telling you what is available, and every site dictates what is best, and best means what is least ecologically harmful and what is most effective to clearing vegetation. All of these things should be done in consultation with experienced professionals. I don't want any of you going out and tilling land or using herbicides with no plan, especially near Skaneateles Lake and other features. So please talk to people about the right way to do this. And I'm happy to go into detail on any of these methods and their potential harms to ecology. I've got a stack of papers ready if any of you have questions at the end. After clearing vegetation, you of course need to sow your seed. There's many ways to do this. You can do it by hand in smaller areas. To give you an idea of what I mean by smaller areas, I've used a crank seeder like the one in this image to seed 7 acres in a day. My arm was sore at the end of the day, but it's totally possible. On larger areas, you may want to use something like a specialized seed drill. We've pictured here at left a Truax seed drill. These drills are specially designed for seeding these types of meadows. They are not the same as a grain drill you would use in agriculture. Maybe it'll be helpful to walk you through a short case study. This is my home, and I made a 2,000 square foot meadow in my backyard, largely to eat up area so I wouldn't have to mow it. This is what I was working with. When I moved in, both the house was falling apart and the landscape hadn't been tended in a couple years. Ignore the house. We're not talking about houses today. We're talking about meadows. And here you can see it's dominated by a lot of weeds, weeds at least in my opinion. And this took a lot of work to achieve. It was very overgrown, and for a whole year I continuously cut it to get this area under control. This is what I was working with when I decided to start my meadow. And I cleared the site. I used one application of herbicide, and then eventually when the plants died, I very gently raked the dead plant matter away from the site to clear the area and expose all of the soil for good soil to seed contact. Now you can see in the foreground there's still a lot of vegetation left. That's all common mullein and white clover, both exotic species, both common in yards. Both of those are very problematic in the early stages of developing a meadow. I should have been a bit more aggressive, and I'm paying for that now, but hey, it is what it is. I also decided to plant a prickly pear cactus in the middle of my meadow. I'm strange like that, so I made a pile of rubble and some gravel, and I have a cactus. After seeding the site, I covered it with some straw mulch. That's simply to protect against erosion. If we were to get a heavy rainstorm before the seeds germinate, it could wash some away. On a site this small, larger erosion control devices like silt fences or berms are unnecessary, even with the slope of this area. The straw mulch also obscures seeds from birds and small mammals that might eat them. You'd be surprised how many they could eat. And remember, this is me scattering seeds by hand rather than drilling them into the soil using a specialized machine. Oh, this was in about a year ago on 4th of July, we did all of this work of seeding the meadow and spreading the mulch. So the meadow currently is a little over a year old, and this is what it looks like now. Again, every meadow can look different, and maybe it's just me becoming a snob having done so much of this work, but I don't want my meadows to look like you would traditionally see in pictures. I don't have showy species like black-eyed Susan and purple coneflower. I like meadows to be green and full of grasses and have native wildflowers that feed very small invertebrates, native bees and wasps, things like that. The meadow is still very young. Like I said earlier, these are dynamic systems. The first year or two of establishing a meadow, it's still going through growing pains, and it doesn't look quite as much like it will when it's more mature. So you notice there's a somewhat messy appearance. I think this is gorgeous, but I can understand not everyone thinks this particular meadow is attractive. But still remember, these systems grow and evolve. You can see in the foreground, these drooping seed heads are Canada wild rye. All of the yellow flowers are lanceleaf coreopsis, which I like in the meadow because they're one of the first species to bloom in May, and they're still blooming right now, even after our frost. Many of the species in my meadow I added intentionally by designing a seed mix like this dotted mint. Many native species showed up on their own, volunteers like this bone set, a wonderful species that has strong associations with pollinators and crop pest predators. Other species showed up as well, this exotic common mullein. And I really don't care about most exotic species. Very, very few of them are actually harmful, and many of them can even add to ecological processes. This common mullein is one of the most important foods for bumblebees in midsummer. They eat the pollen, bring it back to their colonies. If you've never kept a colony of bumblebees, it's adorable. I highly recommend it, and they're wonderful for pollinating native crops like blueberries and some of our tomato species. Finches, especially goldfinches, love to eat the seeds from this mullein, and your meadow could be swarming with finches. Similarly, it's a robust and thick stalk of a plant compared to many of the other species in this area, so it's a perch for larger birds. Just a few examples of why an exotic species isn't necessarily a bad thing. A bit more on weeds. Weeds are really just a matter of perspective. I prefer to call these plants that show up on their own volunteer species. Most of the species you see in this image are volunteers. The white flowers are fleabane daisy. The yellow flowered plant in the center of the image is an evening primrose. All of them showed up on their own. All of them feed pollinators, pollinators that feed birds and other wildlife. I think of creating a meadow sort of like painting. Maybe I just watched too much Bob Ross on PBS as a kid. But my technique when I work with landowners is to establish a meadow primarily to hold soil first. And that's especially important for a lot of landowners around Skaneateles Lake. We want species that are reliable, that will grow and hold the soil. And once those species are established, think of that as your base layer, and then you could begin painting it with highlights of color if you're interested. Lining the entry of a trail with something like the image at left, mist flower for a splash of purple. If there's a shady area near the edge of a meadow, you could add blue-stemmed goldenrod, the center image. Wetter areas, you may want something like obedient plant shown on the right. The point is, these meadows are a phenomenal way to get people directly engaged with their land management. They are also an incredible teaching tool for people, and especially kids, on ecological processes at a scale that's manageable. So forests sometimes can be overwhelming, but you can look over the canopy of a meadow and look at very small scales and see ecology, see succession, see wildlife plant dynamics in action, and teach your family about it. Meadows do require some level of maintenance. Now, of course, they are much less work to maintain than a lawn, but there is still some inputs necessary. Because without intervention, meadows in this part of the world will eventually become forests. Trees and other woody vegetation invade them. Right now, my meadow is growing some staghorn sumac, which I love. As an ecologist, I know that for the time being, it's not problematic. And if I ever want to get rid of it, I'll just go and clip it out, and that's that. Well, of course, I'll have to do it again someday, but it's not that much work. So meadows in this area do require some sort of maintenance to persist. And historically, that's been fire. I am a prescribed fire manager. I don't suggest that we're going to burn meadows in Skaneateles. This technique is not feasible for small residential properties in densely populated areas. But these meadow plants and ecosystems are adapted to periodic fire. Think of lightning strikes. Think of the indigenous peoples that used fires for thousands of years to maintain these habitats to support the plants they used for food and medicine, and the wildlife species like bison that they wanted to hunt. It's kind of funny that we scientists in the last few years have suddenly discovered fire as this management tool when people have known about it for thousands of years. The other component of these habitats is also unlikely for private landowners, and that's the effect of grazing animals. Historically, that was large animals like buffalo. Farther back in human history, it was Pleistocene megafauna, these woolly beasts that roam the landscape. I do a lot of work with farmers grazing our domestic livestock in these areas, like these beef cattle. This is a win-win. Many of the grass species that we use in our exotic pastures and our exotic lawns are poor in nutrition in the middle of summer. They're what we call cool season species. They do most of their growing in late spring and late fall when it's cooler out, whereas a lot of the grasses that are present in these meadows and a lot of the flowers grow in the warm season. That's when they're most nutritious. Any of you who work on cattle farms know it's tough to keep weight on a cow in the middle of summer. It's actually easier to put weight on them in winter. So if you can graze cows in these meadow ecosystems when the grasses are nutritious, the cows are happy, and you can use the cows as a management tool in the meadow to adjust the composition of plants. The cows will want to eat some species more than others. In this case, they wanted to eat the aggressive switchgrass that was starting to dominate the flowers. Again, it's a win-win, but again, probably not practical for most of the properties we're talking about around Skaneateles. Instead, cutting can be used as a substitute for fire and grazing regimes in meadows that are in sensitive areas. And this cutting is nothing like what you would expect in a lawn. When I say cutting, I mean very high cutting. Normally it's 10 inches or more. The first year of establishing a meadow, you often need to cut it a few times to get light to the slower growing plants. And that cutting is 10 inches, maybe 12, maybe as low as 8, but it's not something you can do with a zero-turn mower that we see constantly running on lawns throughout the community. Normally, you might be able to do this with a weed whacker, with a brush cutter attachment, a blade, for meadows of an acre or 2 in size if you have a whole day. But you may need to hire someone with a tractor and a bush hog or other cutting attachment to cut your meadow periodically. Meadows really don't need to be cut more than once a year. Honestly, you could get away with every 3 or 4 or 5 years cutting them. Remember, if you cut a meadow in winter, you're destroying all of that important habitat and shelter for little birds and the animals we want to support. This leads me to the idea of cost savings converting a lawn to meadow. And again, it depends, right? There's so many factors that can influence potential cost savings. Just to name a few, you have to factor in, okay, how much do you currently spend on your lawn care? So how much might you save by taking a portion of your lawn away from lawn care? Also, how much does the seed that you buy to establish your meadow cost? How much do the plugs you may buy to highlight certain areas cost? How much does it cost to clear the area initially? These can all depend on whatever service provider you hire, the topography of your site. If it's highly sloped, it may be more challenging. If it's near sensitive features like wetlands or Skaneateles Lake, that can add another level of erosion control devices you may wish to employ. And you should also factor in your aesthetic goals for the meadow. Certain flowering species, certain grasses are simply more expensive. And if you fall in love with them by looking at Google and designing a meadow mix and suddenly find out they're like $400 a pound, well, your meadow might be more expensive. I tend to think of this process in economic terms. So perhaps a good analogy is thinking of lawn to meadow conversion as making a large capital investment, a large investment in clearing vegetation, in buying a seed mix, and the other elements required to establish a meadow. But in return, you decrease your ongoing management costs. You spend less on periodic mowing, and that's just money. We're not even talking about the other benefits that you get from a meadow in terms of protecting water quality, from providing habitat for biodiversity, from sequestering carbon in these systems that are, in terms of biomass, upside down forests with root systems that go deep into the soil. There are so many benefits to doing this. And finally, before I wrap up and say thank you and take questions, I do want to point out a few thoughts that people give when I talk about meadows. I get lots of misconceptions. People often think that creating a meadow on their property will lead to more mice in their house, and that isn't true. Meadows can support lots of mammal species, rodents like voles, lagomorphs like these bunnies here, insectivores like shrews, but those species aren't exactly the ones that want to get into your house like our Peromyscus and invasive moose mice would want to do. So again, you may get more mammals, but in reality, these aren't the species that will become pests in your home. People also think that they'll start supporting snakes in their backyard, and especially venomous snakes. I get that one a lot. That also isn't the case. You may get snakes dipping into a meadow to eat rodents and other animals, but they need to sun themselves. They would rather be in a lawn that's sunny in certain times of the day than spend their whole day in a meadow where it's shady. And the biggest risk that I am asked about is ticks. All of these things, especially ticks, are elements of meadow ecology that I have personally sampled for over a decade, and I work with researchers who also sample and survey these elements of meadows. So to give you an idea, I have sampled ticks. I've surveyed them in numerous land cover types, meadows, lawns, forests. I always find the fewest ticks, both in terms of abundance and diversity in meadows. And there's reasons for this. One, the deer tick, which spreads Lyme disease to humans, is more of a forest species. They are less common in open areas because those areas are too hot and dry. And two, meadows are a complex ecology. There's numerous predators that can eat ticks in a meadow compared to a lawn where it's a sterile desert. If a medium-sized mammal like a rabbit or raccoon, or a large mammal like a deer is covered in ticks and takes a nap in your yard and those ticks drop off, there's no other animals to eat them in that sterile lawn. You walk by and you get the ticks. As opposed to a meadow, there's so many invertebrate predators, so many vertebrate predators, they may have a controlling effect on ticks that could explain the lower populations in these systems. I guess my last point is too, there are also cultural constraints on lawn to meadow conversion. Not everyone can do this. Certain communities have restrictions on vegetation height in a lawn or vegetation height with distance to a structure. I would suggest to people engaging in meadows to see it like it is, as a form of habitat creation, but also gardening. A sharp boundary around a meadow, a well-tended trail through it. Help people intuit that these are not just messy areas you forgot to mow, but intentional habitats that you designed for biodiversity and landscape value. That's my final point. I want to thank you all for letting me talk about one of my favorite subjects today. I probably said the word meadow 1,000 times, but please email me if you have any questions about this process or any questions about the variety of research initiatives that the Restoration Science Center at ESF engages. I'm looking forward to talking with all of you right now and after. So I'll stop it there and risk saying the word meadow once again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. That was really interesting. I've seen a bunch of questions come in, so I'm going to go to the Q&A first.
Great.
Helen asks, after a few years, how can you prevent the invasion of woody shrubs such as everyone's favorite buckthorn?
So yeah, this subject of invasive plant management and vegetation management in general is near and dear to my heart. My largest role as a habitat manager in my previous job was vegetation management. I've used every technique in the book, from saws to chainsaws to herbicide to animals, you name it. That's what periodic cutting is for. If you cut a meadow every year or every few years, you will suppress that woody vegetation. Again, all of this effect depends on the species and your specific height, your specific site. So buckthorn, for example, if you have a ton of it, it's very difficult to cut individually. If you have maybe a 2-acre meadow and maybe just a few dozen buckthorn or autumn olive or privet or other species of exotic shrub that show up, you could even cut them by hand in late winter when they're very obvious and easier to see. Lots and lots of details. So again, sorry to be frustrating, but the answer to that is it depends, but there are built-in techniques to manage that ecology.
Great. Olivia asks, as a member of the DeWitt Advisory Conservation Commission, which is considering changing town code to allow for non-conventional lawns, she says many town codes don't permit this type of vegetation, especially in front yards. Do you have examples of town codes that allow for intentional meadow conversion or other native habitats, but are also restrictive enough to prevent unintentional or negligent overgrowth of turf grass and non-native or invasive vegetation?
So that's a very specific question, and I'm happy to talk with Olivia more about that. So I don't have examples of specific codes. What I do have is examples of the types of habitat management you can engage in to achieve those objectives. For example, you can use native species that are very low growing that do fit within vegetation height restrictions. You can also use a very small selection of species. Even if you're only using 2 to 3 native species in a lawn to replace an exotic lawn, you're still getting the benefit of using native species that could be eaten by native insects that have ecological associations with those species. Here's an example. People use Bermuda grass in their lawn. It's an exotic warm season grass. Buffalo grass is a native equivalent to Bermuda grass with more animal associations. So If you want a turf grass that only grows a few inches tall and you can aggressively mow, but will also support insects that eat it, you could use buffalo grass. You could also use any number of very short growing species that provide flowers that will look neat and tidy. The point is, you don't have to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Not everyone can have a tall meadow on their land, but you can still do better than a lawn and still reduce the amount of work an individual landowner has to do while promoting biodiversity. Happy to talk more about that very specific question later.
Great. Kathleen says, do you need to, and if so, how do you control invasion by lawn grass or other exotics at the edges of your meadow?
Yeah, so that's why the initial effort to clear vegetation is so important. The better job you do in the outset to kill vegetation within the site, or remove it, kill's a dirty word, remove that vegetation, the less work it will be in the future. Of course, if you have a boundary with turf grass and your meadow, depending on the grass species, depending on the flower species, white clover, for example, those plants can creep into the meadow. Now, once these meadows are established and the grasses and flowers are a couple, 2, 3, 4 feet tall, that invasion isn't problematic. However, yeah, it can be an issue. So I would recommend keeping the borders of a meadow nice and mowed the same way you would manage your lawn already. Once those plants get into a meadow and become problematic, then there's numerous targeted tools you can use. You could hand pull certain species and simply allow the meadow species intermix to get the competitive advantage and cover them over. I definitely don't suggest this for individual landowners, but in my history, I've used targeted herbicide applications, but I don't think that's necessary for what we're talking about here. So I would say that, at a scale of an acre or two and probably less, hand pulling is really all you need to do, or weed whacking to control invasions of herbaceous yard species. I love these technical questions. Great.
Yeah. Kathleen also has another question. Can you recommend some sources of Northeast eco-type seeds?
Sure. So, so that's an important question. And I'm sure I want, no offense to Kathleen if I misinterpret, but I do want to clarify for the other people in this presentation. So ecotyping means even though a species is native to the United States, doesn't mean it's necessarily suited to this region. So if you get seed from a plant grown in Florida, it may not be the best genetic structure to survive in central New York where it's cold and dark all the time. Like we basically live in, Mordor from the Lord of the Rings here compared to Florida. So if you want to get genetically appropriate species for your area, most of the major seed companies like Ernst Conservation Seed, Roundstone Seed, Prairie Moon have growing areas distributed throughout the country, and they will work with you to make sure that when you order seed, they give you the seed that's most genetically appropriate for your site.
Great. Edward asks, or he says, nice job, Sam. He said, are you available to consult on smallish projects?
Sure. Well, that's the easiest answer I gave all day.
Let's see. Let me go over to the chat. Deborah asks, you mentioned clover. Can you elaborate? I left the clover in my lawn alone for the pollinators.
Yeah, so look, I don't mean to demonize clover, and I'm specifically talking about white clover. White clover spreads rhizomatously, so these stems that travel through the top layer of the soil and over ground and root in, so it spreads out. Clover in a yard is great because a yard needs nitrogen fixation, so this is lawn grasses, and clovers provide flowers for pollinators. However, in a meadow, clover can be very problematic. White clover can cover over the area and prevent the germination from these very slow growing grasses and flowers that live for decades but take a long time to grow. They spend their first year or two putting out their root system and only a few blades of grass. Once clover is once the meadow is established and clover gets in, that's okay because these plants grow over it and they will win the light competition. The issue is more that in a yard, clover's great, but meadows, one, don't need nitrogen fixation. They do extremely well on poor soil. They do extremely well on compacted soil to a degree. Some of the photos of meadows I showed you, by the way, are on sites where we staged heavy equipment for construction projects. So talk about poor soil. So yeah, in your yard, definitely leave the white clover. But in a meadow, it's really not ideal. You don't want excess nitrogen, and you don't want that very aggressive mat-forming species out competing young meadow plants.
Awesome. Lori asks, actually a question that I have as well. Are there online other resources available to learn more? Like, do you have fact sheets if people are interested in this with some suggestions for seed mixes and things like that?
Sure. So I do have, it's funny, I do this stuff so much. I've got a huge folder of fact sheets and things like that I've accumulated. I haven't looked at them in a long time. So yes, those things are out there. I would suggest one place to start might be looking at the major seed companies like Ernst Conservation Seed, Roundstone, Prairie Moon, because Ernst, I know for sure in their catalog has basic information on meadow establishment techniques. They also have these companies suggested seed mixes for certain ecological conditions. For example, a wetland mix full of wildflowers versus a sedgy wetland mix or an upland mix, etc. Normally when I do work with landowners, we have very specific objectives in mind, like a particular grassland bird or bolstering an ecosystem service like crop pest predation, and I tailor a seed mix to that purpose. But I would say in general, go to seed companies. They have pre-made mixes, and don't take me talking kind of smack about like common species like black-eyed Susan. It's like, that's why I don't like using river birch, because you see them in Wegmans parking lots all the time. So it's just like they're overused to me, but those are perfectly good species that provide a lot of value to biodiversity. Yeah, so tons of resources out there. I hope that is helpful.
Yeah,
And,
actually.
you can, oh, sorry to interrupt, but I would also point you towards, again, ESF's Restoration Science Center. We're brand new, and our website's coming online, but we will have tons of resources about not just meadows, but any ecosystem you can imagine in the United States and beyond, Galapagos, Siberia. We do things all over the world. I'm just the meadow guy. I also do a lot more than meadows. So please don't think this is the limit of our guidance capacity.
Yeah, actually, so Brandy put in the chat that the Restoration Science Center will have a website soon, which will have information. So that's awesome.
Yeah, Brandy is our development and program manager for the whole Restoration Science Center. I believe Dr. Dr. Anna Harrison's also on the talk. She's also a director of programs for the center. And, I'm just one piece of a very broad and very talented group.
Yeah, Lori also asked a question. Any chance this talk was recorded? Oh, so I can answer that. Yes, it was recorded, and everyone who registered or attended any of the sessions will get an email about where they can find the recordings. Let's see, I don't see any other questions in the Q&A or the chat, so I will just say a huge thank you to our three presenters today, to Sam for talking about meadows, Albert and Max from CNY and Finger Lakes Land Trusts. Thank you all to everyone, whether you stuck with us for all three presentations or you just joined for one or two. I will be sending out an email in the next day or two with links to where you can find all of the recordings, as well as an evaluation where I'd love to get your feedback about this program and any other topics that you'd like to see in the future. Otherwise, I hope you all have a great day, and thank you all again to our presenters.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Great to be in such good company. Thanks, Albert, Max, and Camille.
Thanks all.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone. Bye.